Cadell Last. My goodness, Cadell, how are you doing today? You doing all right?
It's indeed Cadell Last. Yeah.
I know, the one and only. How are you doing,
Am I
Cadell?
am I here?
I
Am I
think there
audible?
there he is.
Yeah, just in a cafe. I was gonna eavesdrop a little bit. I'll just try
Wonderful.
not to be too loud. If I speak, this is not too loud,
No, not at all,
or
my
not.
friend.
This I'm coming through. I'm coming through.
You are coming through. Absolutely. Well, it is a treat to see you, and I'm thrilled for the early marks class. That looks outstanding, and I think really, really important. What are your thoughts on what you've read, your thinking on that so far, Cadell?
One of the things that I'm thinking about is, well, the first thing I'll say is that this tension point between Hegel and Marx to me seems to be where like the stakes are the highest and where my thought has orbited for so long. And I think that of course I've been mostly influenced by Zizek's idea that we need to read Marx through the lens of Hegel instead of the other way around. Um, so I've already said that already, but um, one of the ideas that's probably most at the forefront of my mind recently is kind of a Marxism that is more integrated with the unconscious, impotence, impossibility, and a Marxism that's less sort of oriented towards, I think what Zizek calls the subject supposed to revolt. Those are some of where my ideas are at the moment.
No, I'm extremely interested in that. And Thomas Jockin is good to see you, Andrew Luber and Michael. And Mr. Jockin has one of the walking. I really need to get one of those. I think it's the way. So that looks delightful. Mr. Luber, it is good to see you as well. No, I'm extremely interested in all of it. I mean, I think basically the inability first to think about how the material condition influences our thinking, which then functions in a feedback loop back on the material condition, and how we are shaped then into a framework to treat things in a manner that we're not even conscious of how we're treating them. And then those kind of work to make us more unconscious. So, for example, if we get used to treating everything as sellable, for example, then we start to associate values, responsibility, a good use of time, a good person with that of which contributes to commodity or selling or making things fungible or different things like that. And then also we can use all of that to hide from ourselves in different ways. So I think that's very interesting. I think that's important. I was just reading, I was just talking with Justin Murphy about he had a little reading group on the guy Palantir Carp. He has a new book out called the what do you call it? The Technological Republic. Javier, good to see you. And he's kind of making this argument for the need of the state, like technology in these Silicon Valley companies. And I know you were just speaking with Ben, so I kind of be curious any thoughts anyone has on this, and you, Cadell, as well. Because I go back because it's the kind of argument that, hey, when you look back during the Roosevelt ages or World War II or whatever, you see that the government got really involved in investing in technology and how that really kind of spurred on growth and was really a great thing. Um, and so he's kind of basically, Karp is basically arguing that, he's Palantir. So he's all about, getting technology in bed with the government and all of that with what Palantir does. And kind of saying that not enough Silicon Valley companies are, patriotic. They need to be more interested in the well-being of their country, not just their profit motivator, and so on and so on and so forth. One of the reasons I bring this up is because there's one part of it that sounds kind of anti-capitalist, right? It's kind of this idea of we need to be more interested in the well-being of the state and the government, not just be looking for corporate profit or different things like that. But then in another way, it seems to be falling back into a certain mistake of, what did they use all of the technology for in World War II? Atom bombs, killing people, various technology, and then also this technology has perhaps led into some unintentional consequences. The other thing, I'll give it to Luber here. I also think Mr. Karp, it's really important. Marcise Olson and Rauch, they talk about how one of the reasons why the government was able to get in bed with companies and invest was because all the special interest groups were taken out by the war, like in Japan. They were small, right? Now you have a thriving K Street that really gets in the way of any gigantuous government programs or Manhattan projects. Because CARP is saying, we need that with AI. We need this big government program that's interested in AI. And or else basically China's going to eat our lunch. But first off, I think that the conditions for something like the the government interventions or investments are basically obliterated by special interest groups, K Street, and all of those other things like Marcise Olson talks about. The second reason I bring it up is because, of course, nowhere in CARP do we see any coming to terms with Hegel or Marx or the unconscious, right? You're actually just going to ultimately be projecting some sort of fantasy into this state technological partnership that won't be dealing with the realities of the subject, which will lead to unintentional consequences. And then also, I mean, I have sympathies with Mr. Karp, but then the question is, should it just be open source? Maybe it should just be an open source model. Those were just some thoughts that were coming to mind because it's just, I guess I would say to you, Cadell, like as I was reading Karp's book, I was kind of thinking about the yet to come to terms with Hegel, Lacan, Marx, like the yet to come to terms with the unconscious and how we're just steamrolling ahead with a certain previous way of doing things that may just reiterate previous unintentional consequences. But it's beautiful to see you, Cadell. I'll give it to Luber here. Mr. Luber, how are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing well. It's a beautiful day in LA, and it's good to be on the call with everyone. I think what you're touching on is really good because basically the question is, how do you have a niche and stay within your niche and respect other people's niches, essentially? Because the problem is, well, one, like you said, it's like kind of like what I was saying on the last Zoom with like Trump endorsing like the Tesla, you know. The problem is once a company gets in bed with the government, they want to be the only company that gets in bed with the government because they want to make the most amount of profit. So with that being said, how do you create a space where you have like a car company get in bed with the government, but not want to be the only car company that gets in bed with the government? So, like for example, a car company that specializes in like motorcycles or just like a certain type of like niche function for a car, and just staying in that lane and only staying in that lane without overreaching and trying to expand. So like another example is like Dyson, like the vacuum company. I was at the mall the other day. I went to the store. I couldn't believe the different products they're now launching. And with that, it's like they have hair products. And I'm asking the lady, I'm like, I don't understand how it went from a vacuum cleaner to a hair straightener. They just seem like completely different things. And she was just saying it all has to do with the motor. So what they did was just air a motor that has to do with like airflow, essentially, a certain type of airflow mechanism. And they have air purifiers now and all these different kind of things. Um, and they have headphones. I'm like, what? Not to go on a tangent with it. They have headphones, and I'm like, Dyson has headphones, $500 headphones. Jesus God, oh my God. Um, I basically what they did was they took what was initially a niche and they kind of like manipulated it such that they can kind of like go into different markets, and that is just like the capitalistic mindset. So I just think the hurdle with this hypothetical, if you will, is even when one finds a niche, it's like I'm gonna figure out a way to expand that niche. It's still gonna be considered a niche, where yeah, I'm Dyson and I have this type of engine or whatever you want to call it, motor, whatever, and I'm still fitting within my niche, but yet uh, the amount of different products hit different markets now. So I just think um, it's just the problem with capitalism, and even the problem with, finding a certain niche and sticking within that niche, but also sticking to the product that that niche is generating, essentially. Um, so I it's hard for me to think what that would be like, and that even in my mind that applies to like philosophy. Like everyone knows everything in a way, and I'm like this can't this. I feel like you got to. I mean, there's polymaths like we've talked about. Okay, so I have that in the back of my mind, but yet at the same time, it's like maybe the polymath has a certain mode in which they do their work, and that mode is their niche in a certain way. Um, that might be a bit of a stretch, but just even philosophically and just thinking wise, staying within your niche and actually like not trying to like go past or go beyond that particular niche or like product of thought that is generated out of that niche. Because I always had a trouble where it's like, if you know everything, the jack of all trades, but master of none. I think that's something like that. But yeah, it's the same problem. I think like it's just the human tendency in a way to kind of find that limit, and as you would always say, Daniel, you got to go past it to find it. So I just think it's like an inherent human condition issue, and maybe not even just a capitalistic issue. But yeah, I mean, I'll just say I think some of the great thinkers, it seems like they have a certain niche or a certain mode of access into being in a certain sense, or just life itself, however you want to frame it. And they just stick with that throughout their entire life. And that's what made them great, is just literally having the capacity to stay within that domain, if you will. Yeah, it's just that it's ironic in a certain sense, because at first you would think, oh, like the greats would be the ones that they have a niche, and somehow it creates all these different products, and it changes everything in a certain sense. But I think that's how you get forgotten, and how you actually water down all those products in a certain sense. Where if you just stay within your certain field, or just that specific dimension that you're really focused on, and you generate out of that dimension, and the generation, the products are only kind of contained within that dimension, then it's probably going to lead to great products. Like I wouldn't be shocked if Dyson, like if they have a fall off, because they're kind of watering down, and it's like they're kind of doing everything now instead of just vacuums. Like I remember they had like the top tier vacuums. Like if you have a vacuum and it's Dyson, like holy shit. But like maybe 10 years from now it might not be like that, because they're like going into headphones and hair straighteners and other things that have nothing to do with vacuums in a certain sense. But they'll rationalize and be like, oh no, it's the motor. It's all the same motor, and that's why it's so great. But I mean, I'll just say one more thing. Actually, what I was going to say was going to make no sense, so I'm going to pass it off.
No, well, what you're saying with the corporate power, again, what I'm just very interested in Karp's book, you see this kind of reiteration of this argument of, well, it's kind of like if we don't marry state and AI companies together, we're doomed, right? There's this kind of apocalyptic logic that is racing it ahead. And of course, I'm always notably skeptical of those kind of apocalyptic arguments, right? Because it's really not tearing with the thought. It's not patience of the concept, as Cadell emphasizes, which I think is very important. It's like, we got to do this or we're all dead. Well, obviously Palantir would benefit greatly from increased government investment in different things like that, right? And you see, I'm also, it's one of those books as well, from what I can tell, that has a certain, how can you go against this? Because AI is such a powerful technology. And that's kind of the appeal of the argument. And it's very interesting because I think Karp was a student of Habermas. He's aware of some of the Frankfurt School's thinking, I would think, but doesn't, I don't see it reflected so much. And that's could just be another leg of this state corporate power mixture that well, further perhaps seems to be inevitable because we haven't done the work of developing the subject, coming to terms with ourselves as human beings, and trying to create the conditions of the social so we can be convivial, and thus we just give ourselves over to some sort of manipulative fate. And again, it's this book that has a lot of reviews, glowing reviews, Isaacson and people like that, but it also for me is an example, because obviously I'm being quite critical of the book. Is also an example of the kind of book that if you don't do thinking or philosophy, you actually think is a good book because it has this surface of a argument that kind of adds up. And how can you go against it? Well, and actually for me, it shows you why it's so important to know history and to have studied the historic period around FDR and World War II and government investment, right? Because it's not such a clean picture at all. And also the historic condition shifts. Generally, the greatest government investment that has the stimulated effect is around war. Okay, Carp. So you're basically Carp is basically saying war. That's what we're going. Thanks, Carp. Is that really the self-fulfilling prophecy that we want to have? And the appeal of the argument indirectly is war with China is inevitable. Okay, that's going to be the case. And that yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Jockin. And so that to me is a problem. The other thing I will note with the polymath quickly, there's two other elements of Burke's book I have found very interesting. One, how many polymaths had unpublished material, as in they felt as if like they didn't publish it because they're like, they were working through these thoughts, which is interesting. You know, they were wrestling with these terms themselves to illuminate, to explore, but they were very slow to come out. Like the majority of Leibniz's papers are never published, like the majority. And you could argue also another technique that they used was hysteric writing, like kind of concealing their arguments, actually. If they did publish it, like the analysis of Citas, there was this certain concealing that is very interesting because one can view these techniques as sort of trying to avoid the dilution. The other thing is these polymaths, I think this is also very important, went into other fields, they were tinkering fields. It wasn't just thought fields, like they were using their hands, right? They were like, Michel Planier is a chemist. He is in the laboratory. He is also, say, if he's traveling to other countries. Leibniz is, it always blows my mind, he's an expert on China. He is traveling. He's a librarian, right? So there's also something to be said about the problem with having many fields without skin in the game or without using your hands. That seems to contribute also to this problem of this dilution effect that occurs. And I've just been very interested in the polymath because it's very clear that there have been these people that have studied a lot of things and have done very well, but what is it about them that seems unique in the 16th century versus some of these people that seem to know it all, generalists, but there's this dilution effect. Using the hands, unpublished manuscripts, there's some very interesting things there that seem to be part of the equation. But I think the Dyson example is also quite interesting because that's almost where, the intellectual needs to use their hands and not spread beyond the use of their hands or skin in the game. And then companies need to not expand beyond the intellectual work they've done. There's some sort of bothness. I have to word that better, but let me give it to Mr. Jockin, Javier, and then Michael. Mr. Jockin.
Stealing my thunder, Daniel, because I was going to make a comment on this whole corporate government interaction is absolutely around war. It's most obvious. It's from history we know that's the whole protocol of it, or a very big background and context for it. An important detail too to pick up is that technically government is already doing this in the sense that in knowledge generation it's from government grants, either directly or indirectly, because every professor is a state employee. We forget this fact. The state schools for every state university, there are state employees. That's not even counting grants. That again, kind of the thing we always find exhausting about academia is when there's like obsessional with grant acquisition, etc. But I'm just pointing out, like, this is already happening. It's been happening. It just isn't maybe necessarily with Karp. I haven't read his text yet, so I can't comment what he's thinking or is imagining. It's already occurring. But with some consequences. And a big issue is what you just brought up, is the siloing effect. One of the major important details here is that academia notoriously is siloed horrendously. And actually what Cadell is bringing up about the biggest issue of the kind of the subject is interaction with the world and kind of how we're going to mesh this. Daniel, your big project with belonging again. How are you going to, in a post-democracy state where there's no belonging, and the old models of modernism isn't going to work except for war. If you're not going to go back to the old models, what are we going to do to move forward? And unfortunately, every war is fought with the last one's paradigm, aka World War I was fought with the Civil War mandate. World War II was thought through the World War I mandate or paradigm. It's the same move. Gulf War, Vietnam, we keep going. So every war is fought with the last paradigm. So what's probably going to happen is that, and we're kind of seeing some tensions about this with like Ukraine, for example. It's like we're starting to see. I think that the Ruddy, I think it was Ruddy was his name, but you sent me a link once, Daniel, on talking about drone warfare and its operation in Ukraine. Again, that's a really good example where we're seeing the tensions of old paradigms interacting with new domains or tensions. So I just bring this up because this idea of the generation of knowledge and its application has been siloed in academia for a long time. I actually really swear the biggest, it's not AI, it's a huge break. It's Sci-Hub. I swear to God, Sci-Hub is the best thing that's been ever made because that obliterated one of the arguments of why academics was kept to the state level and controlled by entities, because you had to pay access for these papers. And guess what? Anyone with a Sci-Hub, Lubra, Sci-Hub is basically like Napster for academic papers. So if you want almost any paper, it's not every single one, but because here, I'll be blunt, I use it all the time. Like if I can't get access to it because my universities do not have access to certain resources, I use Sci-Hub without abandon on any kind of research you're looking for. So what you can do is you could just get the DOI number, the identification number of it, load it in, you got your paper, boom. And then you can read, you can basically be at the level of the elite experts, of the elite academics in these fields that are state-backed, all this other stuff. So the actual decentralizing open source quality, I would make the argument is Sci-Hub. Forget AI, Sci-Hub is actually the most relevant thing. Now, you combine Sci-Hub with an AI aspect, where you're playing with some very interesting things here. AI hallucinates, there's big problems with it, but so actually I'm more on the team of, I think, committed individuals who are the polymaths that have basically by using platforms like Sci-Hub, which are constantly decentralized, so thus when they get taken down for copyright infringement, they just repopulate elsewhere rapidly. I think actually that's the critical mass, in my personal opinion, because now knowledge has no longer been decentralized, has been locked up in these silos. Sci-Hub is basically allowing polymaths to basically cross any topic they want. They get the best research possible on it, best scholarship, the most contemporary points about it, and it's going to be incredibly disruptive. How long has Sci-Hub been around? Maybe 10 years, maybe 5 years. We've yet to see the outcome of what that's going to do in terms of what will polymaths do with that kind of research capacity. So basically, if you do a combo of like Google Scholar with Sci-Hub, when you can't get access to the paper, you basically got access to the best scholarship available, past and present. Personal, that's a take I like to just share. But because the other note, and this actually relates to basically kind of actually what, I don't know, it wasn't brought up in this group, it was by John Nicole yet, but the whole DeepSeek versus the China AI move, like it's just kind of on that point. We have to remember what it basically did. It just did what it was doing, what ChatGPT and everybody else was doing with efficiency, way faster efficiency. So it's just done way cheaper and more effective. That's fine, but that's just to point out, like in terms of the kind of geopolitical thrust of what's going on here, it's really more of how we're going to use these technologies. Probably from a political, social, a geopolitical context, besides drone warfare, is how information is going to be managed like this. And that's why I'm bringing up this whole Sci-Hub angle. Because now the limitations or breakages from getting the research is basically next to zero, in my opinion. So I just want to share, that note, because, I do also want to share that the kind of this question of the patriotic value of a corporation, legally it doesn't really apply. So I don't know what's up with that. I haven't read Karp's paper, like the technological thing. I haven't read that book yet, so I can't comment. But we know that corporations have a mandate to their stakeholders. So the only way this makes sense is if the government becomes a stakeholder, which it actually could, because there were cases of the last economic crash in 2008, so the Treasury did acquire assets, basically stress assets. So they were owners of them. In theory, you could have the government, basically a government entity, be a stakeholder. We also have these weird kind of cross-blended operations like Fannie Mac and Sallie Mae. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that theoretically the governments, and actually other governments have done that too. I think Saudi Arabia or Finland, I forgot. One of them actually they have stake in Pacific private entities with ownership stake in it. So in theory, it could happen. So that could be a way to retrofit. I don't know if they said in the book, that's a way to get basically the stakeholder for the corporation does to work that mechanism of interest to be the government's per se. But it's also very, and again, we get very nervous about that because I think our conceptual model of, we think corporations are supposed to be these ahistoric age political entities, but maybe not. And also, to even be fair, even their existence is technically a political fiction, right? Because governments have to grant them their existence and prevent and allow them to have the ability to hold risk. Because that's the whole purpose of these things. The whole purpose of these entities is allowing the stakeholders, the people inside, to take risk without direct personal skin in the game penalty. That's its whole logic. Now, banks are just or the disastrous over explosion of that, which I have commentary on because I think that's a problem. When financial instruments become assets, as opposed to Dyson, which at least is still material objects being made, when financial instruments are actually now the asset in question, they have this power of the infinite, basically. This is always why the older traditions, Aristotle, have always cautioned against this with usury. They think this is really dangerous because it has this explosive quality to it of any kind of compounded interest or money making going on. Stop there, but the good conversation so far.
Well, what you're saying, I mean, the idea of the financial institution is almost like the polymath that doesn't have to bring it to some tinkering, some hands, right? You know, at least if corporate structure, like that seems to be the problem is intellectuals who do a lot of things that have no skin in the game, right? And then also they, and Thomas Sowell talks about this, this is why I'm so interested in this tradition of unpublished works. They're publishing, he once said about Keynes that, he would talk about a subject that he was an expert in, and then another subject that he just flipped through some pages in with the same authority, right? And so that creates all sorts of problems, right? But what's interesting with Keynes is obviously when he is dealing with more of banking and different things, he's literally at the negotiations. He's literally working through things, going through sleepless nights. There's at least a degree of suffering in that work that seems to bring about a different focus of thought. Now, again, we can say that Keynes, in my opinion, the mistake of Keynes is he conflates stimulating demand with creating demand. We've talked about it very often, but other than that axiomatic shift, he basically is correct that, yes, that's correct, Mr. Parsons, that Mr. Keynes is correct that if demand falls below a certain event horizon, you cannot stimulate it with supply at the same rate that it went down. Now, I'd have to go into all of that, but there's some insight there that's very, very important. But what you were saying with the banks, they're kind of like these fields that end up in everything. In fact, they can just, if they have an investment over here that fails, they can just parry. They can just pivot to a different location, right? And that fluidity of movement that is not bound by any actual product or material condition seems to be extremely problematic and lead to various dysfunctions. Where if at least you had to make a product, even if you're getting into many, many different areas, you cannot so quickly move to something else, which if you are dysfunctional, you would want to have you be more bound to a single thing, so that you go down with that ship as opposed to move to something else. Christian, great to see you, sir. I'll give it to Javier and Michael. The Fannie issue has not been dealt with at all. We've been punting that down the road through various court cases for a very long time. Yeah, I mean, basically just as a quick note, and I actually think the question of open source is extremely interested here. With DeepSeek, and there was also a recent one they put out, Moby. It starts with an M that escapes me, that I was looking at, that also has this open source structure, because we might be seeing the age of actually economic, I don't want to say warfare, but strategy, because if you were to say put out open source technology like DeepSeek and NVIDIA, which is part of the, say, Magnificent Seven, that you could argue that its role in the stock, there's basically seven. You could almost argue that the U.S. stock market is held up by seven companies at this point. They call it the Magnificent Seven. Well, if those companies depend on AI technology continuing to develop, and open source goes in, and suddenly those companies have a shaving off of their profit, well, then those Magnificent Seven could go down, and it drags down the entire stock market. Right now, this depends, though. Some people say that wouldn't happen with NVIDIA because I guess it's called the Jacobson paradox, where as a good becomes cheaper, actually more people are using it. You could make that argument. Well, maybe that would benefit software companies, but I'm not so sure about hardware companies, actually, with the Jacobson paradox, where when things are cheaper, people use it more. That question has to be gotten into. But I guess it's funny because I guess what I'm seeing in CARP is almost, instead of techno-feudalism, techno-nationalism. And is techno-nationalism really the way? That seems regressive and different. But it's like, but what else are we going to do, right? But that whenever anyone appeals to a certain apocalyptic scenario, that seems to be, well, that's when they're saying we need to stop thinking, when actually that's when thinking needs to begin. As we've as been emphasized with Hegel and Cadell's work, it's so important at this point where it sees like, no, there's no more to think. That's exactly when you need to tarry with the negativity. But it's interesting because there's almost like a techno-nationalism in CARP. But let me give it to Javier and Michael. So Javier Rivera, please.
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, I don't know too much, but I didn't know that one thing I listened to would possibly apply. So Catherine Malibu has been working on understanding anarchy. She's saying that it's a recent book that came out, and she's claiming that we really haven't thought philosophically what anarchy is. A big claim, but it's really interesting because in that talk, she's pulling this idea that communism is just already behind logically, because capitalism has already caught up with the anarchic logic. It's more of a, she's basically saying technology is inherently anarchic, and that's why the state wants to control it. So in her opinion, communism and all these ideas are lagging behind the logic. She thinks that we're completely missing the fruitful advantage of how we can become anarchic, which is, I think this is why she's tackling this problem of like, well, what is anarchy and what does it really mean? It kind of makes sense to me when she put it that way, seeing Elon Musk and kind of infiltrate through and everything. I mean, it's very interesting that technology is kind of anarchic in a way, because it's like the only thing you can do as a state is try to control it. Like, because if you don't, well, then it's just everybody can use it. And then that's the panic button, right? Well, if everybody can use it, where's our niche? Right? Where's my niche? So it's interesting. So I was thinking about that. I haven't read her book. I'm really interested in reading it because I feel like Catherine Malibu does have something very interesting to say in relation to this kind of topic, anarchy, government, state, and all this stuff. And then I was also thinking about how I was just reading through Heidegger's Being and Time, and the way Heidegger describes fear is very interesting because he gives this metaphor of like, when there's a burning building, you just kind of panic and you just start grabbing shit that's closest to you. That like, it's just like totally indifferent. And it makes me think that when people expand their niche, I'm like playing with Luber's like words here, it's kind of like that. They just start grabbing at whatever they can do to expand, but it's like not a actual it's not a facing of themselves, so to speak, right? Just to kind of use like an existential kind of framing to this problem, is that when people want to expand their niche and diffuse themselves, it's a fear state of mind. So they keep expanding. And that kind of makes sense to me, even intuitively. Now, the one thing I want to ask about Jockin is that Heidegger brings up in Being and Time is that Aristotle made some comment. This is Heidegger's words. Aristotle made some comment that fear is kind of like depression. I don't know if that's true. I have to look it up in my book. I remember I saw it last night, but I thought that was very interesting. Because then it might make sense of some of the capitalistic anxieties, frameworks, all this promotion of self-help, self-help, and uh, you know, but yeah, so it's interesting that at least in the Heideggerian sense, anxiety is never encountered the more you stay in the state of fear, because anxiety is, at least for Heidegger, at least when you start to see things as insignificant, but we don't want to see things in their insignificance, which is interesting. Or at least we don't let ourselves encounter insignificance because we keep expanding, right? We keep reaching out these in different areas of concern. So it makes me wonder, like, what exactly is a polymath in a real sense? Because I imagine there is sincere polymaths, not polymaths constructed by fear. um, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that's it. That's all I gotta say.
No, I like what you're saying about, well, there is something about fear of AI that keeps you from facing the negativity of the subject, the anxiety of yourself, right? There's some sort of projection. I mean, also there's something about, there's almost for me a little bit of hedging with CARP where it's like, hey man, if the AI technology in Palantir is used to destroy the world, well, I didn't want it to be. I had this idea of going for nationalism and it all would have been great. So if it doesn't, I wasn't the bad guy. A certain disavow almost that could be there. And a book can have, maybe Karp's book was extremely intricate and the editors cut it down because if it's going to be a New York Times bestseller, it has to have that 210-page cover, conclusion, case studies in the middle structure. So there could be a great intricate, because again, he was a student of Habermas. So I maybe there is depth that I'm being cruel regarding. But there is something too that there's a bit of hedging in there. And I guess the other thing, then I'll give it to Michael, that's coming to mind with this open source question. I do think of I was there when you look at the history of the Second Amendment and the idea of people have a right to bear arms. There's an idea that it's not just tied to self-defense, but there was a problem in the ancient world, which is a standing military. If you have a standing military, that means you have a central power, and that means it can't really be run by the people, right? So the moment you have a standing power, because Karatani makes a distinction between Iona and Athens, and he says Iona was actually a real democracy run by the people, much more philosophical, but they had no standing army, and so they were destroyed, right? Whereas if you have a standing army, you can defend yourself, and therefore, but it comes at the risk of needing a central power that taxes you, and then they govern you and they control you, right? The idea of the Second Amendment, not that I'm trying to romanticize it, was a notion of, well, if you have everyone was armed, then you have a standing militia in the populace itself, as opposed to needing a standing army, right? So this is how it's interesting because military and self-governance are strongly tied together, and the Second Amendment is tied to the possibility of self-governance. Now, Studebaker was making the point, this is exactly right, is that unfortunately military technology got so advanced that, you can't have average people having cruise missiles, right? Well, then you need a standing army then. And so the Second Amendment no longer has that function, and therefore there's a lot of confusion about what the Second Amendment is about, right? But it is very interesting that the idea of the militia is tied to the problem of a standing army taking away self-governance, right? So here's my point. Is there a way in which open source returns a possible self-defense of people because people can all code and maybe they have the technology to defend themselves and that could work against a central power, right? Now it opens the door of extreme terrorist attacks or something like that, or we all being destroyed. But is there something about open source that might actually enable a new sort of return to people being able to defend themselves, or at least not having, because if military armaments are going to go heavy in the direction of AI, drone warfare, and different things like that, then it would seem to me coding would be very, very important. AI would be very important. And is there some sort of and I'm not saying this is the case, is there some way in which open source AI would help you deal with this problem of centralization, or would it just be the apocalypse? Because that's the argument that's being made. You can't open source it because some rogue actor would get it and destroy the power grid or something, right? Well, that means you have a central power. Well, if you have the government, this and they alone have this technology. There's a lot of risks with that, especially if you have some sort of techno nationalism that develops, right? Then who knows what could be done at that point, right? But then, of course, if everyone had this technology, they would need to be the kind of subjects who could handle that technology. They would also need those skills, and there's other things that open up. But it is interesting to me to entertain the open source question with some sort of Second Amendment address that brings back a possibility of shrinking the gap between self-governance and self-defense, where you're not going to need a central power. So those are thoughts, but let me give it to Michael here. Michael, please.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to go back to the Dyson comment, because I had something to say, and then kind of where the conversation's gone. I don't have as much to say, but maybe it'll tie together. I was thinking when Andrew was talking about, kind of this kind of like what Dyson's done is they've taken like the central like core mechanism of their product, like the motor, and then they've seen basically how many different products can that be utilized to, and thus they've kind of spread their uh their products. I had a friend who I think he's still in the process of writing a book on kind of like demystifying the stories behind the greatest scientific inventions of all time. And he's a really interesting guy, and it's working out to be a really interesting book. And he contracted me to research he wanted to write the story behind the computer, but like all the way back to like the first like computational machines that were built in like the 1800s. And so the first basically like kind of general use computational machine, it was like this like massive thing, and it was first used to solve quadratic equations, and then um it was yeah, it was kind of like kind of based on like a lot of sewing machine technologies with like you would kind of like I don't really understand it. Like, one of the one who um basically was like one of the founders, her name's Ada Lovelace, who most people don't know about because the machine was really credited to this man, Charles Babbage. She had this like she was actually the daughter of uh Lord Byron. So she had like this like real like poetic artistic sensibility, but was also like this brilliant scientist. And she realized like, and it's kind of like where her and Babbage like really like parted ways, is she realized how math was in everything. And so she saw this machine as being capable of like writing music and, being like this like artistic, like used in this artistic way, not just simply in like this kind of computational mathematic way. And so I was thinking about that in relation to the Dyson thing, because there's it occurs to me that like a part of beauty is being able to see patterns, like pattern recognition, right? Like being able to see like, you know, sacred geometry, for example, things like this, where you see math in all sorts of different arenas. And, the greatest composers realized this as well. Um, and so, there's like a version of um, become mineralist and like kind of trying to in a very capitalistic way, like kind of monopolize one industry, or kind of try and you know proliferate yourself into a lot of different ones. That's like problematic. But I wonder if there's like a flip side to that, where it's it's used in a way where like beauty is really what's being selected for in, like, and I think that's what great art is. Like great art that kind of moves the needle is, kind of necessarily is like a fusion, either like a fusion between different genres or kind of like, this creative tinkering that you're talking about that kind of gives birth to a new genre where you're seeing patterns in, I mean, a lot of people define creativity as like putting two ideas that have never, before been put together, right? And so like I don't know, maybe like there was some like creative news that was like, wait, like there's this motor that, we really perfected in this vacuum, but like, can we put that in a hair, a hair product? Like, and that being like kind of like a stroke of creative genius. And then, obviously in the context that it is, if one person says that, you're going to have 50, whatever, execs that are just going to run with that and be like, oh, profit, like, haha, like, um, so I just kind of wanted to put that forth of like, what exactly, like, what exactly is the balance between that capitalistic proliferation and pattern recognition that's beautiful? I'd be curious to hear like, what Thomas or what anyone thinks about that.
No, I think this is a huge question. Like, there seems to be an over demonization of going into many fields, but then there seems to also be a true problematic tendency to go into many fields, right? That leads to delusion or overconfidence. That can happen, like, where you think you know something, but you're actually just overconfident, right? So there are these major, major concerns because then you have this danger of specialization that leads to a one-track mind that then becomes really problematic if, say, you get into places of authority or you're writing laws and you have one specialization, so you're more prone to have unintentional consequence or implement something that actually reduces human beings, or it leads to some sort of, like I said, black swan, some sort of unintentional consequence. I think this is a massive question. A few things that come to mind. First, going into a different field with a true humility toward the master. Like you go in saying, I am stupid. I really need to know the master, put myself under someone, actually. That seems to be very important versus saying, oh, I'm really good in economics. I can do physics too. That's like one of the things that's interesting, again, with these 16th century polymath people is when they go into other fields, it really, in my opinion, is from this place of, I am stupid. I am dumb. I am going to actually put myself under something. And again, it is, what were we saying the other week? The noob being a noob again. Like if you're a world-class expert on a field, like it takes a lot. It takes quite something to say, I'm going to put myself into a new field as a starter, as a noob, like leave behind my expertise, right? There's a lot of negativity that has to be faced in that. So there's something about that, like putting yourself under the mastery of those in those fields, if you're going to do it, and then truly like being committed to the long term of that work, right? I think putting yourself through that emotionally is very, very difficult. And unfortunately, you could say that the problem with the specialization culture is there's incentive to never do that. And you can make money not doing that. And your reputation could be threatened, right? So that contributes to the tendency of overconfidence. Because again, there seems to be a ditch either on, I just do this one thing. But of course, the problem is you're still a person in that one thing, and maybe you're cutting yourself out. There's those unintended consequences. And then, of course, like you could say these companies like Palantir, even if they wanted to do one thing, they couldn't because they're making a technology that can be applied or taken up by governments and used in different things, right? So there's a certain error in acting as if things can be so cleanly isolated, but then there is also a problem in not binding yourself to something. So what is the binding principle? Humility. I think also what we see these networks of people interacting, right? These polymaths know one another. The David Hume, And Adam Smith, for example, they're interacting. Randall Collins, Vienna Circle. There's something about also the movement into other fields being tied to relationships with other people and learning how to work with other people and the negativity that comes with that, as opposed to this isolated individual doing their own generalist studies. So there's something about humility, network, that seems really, really important. And then also not having a savior mentality. Well, also, I will say this, another characteristic, in my opinion, is many people, when they do generalists, they bracket out, though, like the areas where they have to make decisions, like politics or economics or family or these sort of areas where you actually have to do that of which could be falsified or do that of which has real stakes, right? It's one thing to be involved in a lot of areas where you don't pay a price or you can use your status to keep people out, and an entirely another thing where you're moving in different areas that can cost you, and also you're moving into different areas because you're literally trying to figure out how to live, right? You've encountered problems and you're like, and that is the anchoring. You've encountered realities that you're trying to work with and to figure out and to really take seriously. And that too seems to create an anchoring principle that keeps you from overconfidence or status because it's not working, right? Like if you create this big reputation and the point of you thinking is reputation, well, then you've done it. But if the point is ultimately to deal with real problems and real negativities and real relationships, for example, well, if it's not working, it's not working, right? Like what you're thinking. So that I think having real problems is also a binding principle to this equation. But I'll pause and give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin.
No, excellent points. Michael, on your questions that you pinged me, and Javier pinged me too for a sec. So I'll talk to two of those points before I reply to anyone else. Yeah, Michael, I mean, you're bringing up an example I wanted to give is actually a Nassim Taleb point about adding wheels to suitcases, domain blindness, right? Like it was the when there was a time when that was completely not thought of. It was just like, what do you mean? You just pick up your suitcase and go, and you carry it across to the airport. Then someone had a moment of inspiration, and they had a cross domain understanding, and realized, hey, how about we put some wheels in this thing, and then it'd be a lot easier. As an example, and of course, what happens is any moment of beauty is when there's a retroactive, that was always the case. And then we forget. And that's always that kind of forgetting part. There's a glimmer and then there's a forgetting. So in terms of like, that tends to be the pattern. You know why? Because then the wheels get added on and they were innovative and very much had that presence of inspiration at the moment. But then it became a commodity. It became then duplicated. And it became now the invisible background horizon again, in which everyone operates on. So this is always the most challenging part about beauty, and Daniel and me have talked about this before, is always that it has a glimmering quality in the sense that it has these strikes, which then instantly transform into the good, and then operations like Nash equilibrium / like movement to the kind of tendency to aggregate demand into the average, right? So basically the exemplar that strikes with this really powerful image of a whole new paradigm of understanding. Wait, we can put our suitcase wheels in our suitcases and cart them. We don't have to carry them. Then becomes mean. Becomes basically a mean that everything now aggregates towards, and then demand economically is generated via demand to come to the norm. Basically, come to the mean. So beauty has transformed into a good and operated as such from that. So I just see that as a normal. That's the way I'll explain this. And by the way, this is generally how design, I've argued recently in lectures, how it operates. We make on a simple, obvious, on a very dumb level, it's like we make things which produce experiences. Those experiences are potentially new realities or engagements. So we can use artifacts to do that, but it also can be paradigms. It could be images. It could be this basically strike of something new, an encounter that then people individually experience, and then hilariously, retroactively, later on, we can statistically prove later. Meaning, like, most designers don't operate with statistics. We don't work that way. What we do is we kind of gather qualitatively the experience, the material, and formal conditions of the situation, propose an intervention, usually, or sometimes a removal. Sometimes removal by simplification process. So we're simplifying interactions or objects or parts. Sometimes it's that, sometimes we add. But either way, there's an intervention which then creates a new experience for individuals that are multiple, because design has always been predicated generally within multiplication. So generally when we do something, especially once it's manufactured, it has a scale quality instantly built into it. So thus we're producing patterns that are then exposing to many individual experiences that then ironically then we validate after the fact with statistical analysis and other things, some more than others. Anyways, I'm just pointing out, like, just to kind of talk through, that's exactly what happened with the suitcase. I really doubt someone sat there and did a study to figure out we had to put wheels on our suitcases. Someone had an image and then produced an artifact with that image, and that produced that created a new paradigm that had a strike. That strike was beauty, or way I would argue that'd be a moment of beauty, which then transformed instantly once people saw it was going to work into a good. And then economic demand, as we would expect, operates as expected, became a commodity. And thus we basically now became not a question of if there could be wheels on suitcases, but now how can we do it and do it cheaper, faster, quicker, right? That kind of stuff. Hope that answers your question, Michael. Could that be just an off the cuff point about that? Now, another note about that is actually to Daniel's comment about arrogance of knowledge, and actually related to Javier too, because Javier, so Aristotle doesn't have depression, he has melancholia. So that's there. So, but that is related, and it probably is what Heidegger's meaning. I'm going to guess. I have to look into double check. But I have a feeling it's probably melancholia was being mentioned by Aristotle, and it does have a relationship to fear. So that's actually correct. That association is correct. And actually, if you go to that section, it's really interesting because I thought of a note from Daniel is the note about courage as a virtue. And actually, that's the most, if there's any virtue the citizens must have, it's that. I think it was an interesting note from Aristotle. And he says, because as opposed to, two notes. One is citizens need to have courage because they have to be willing to fight and die for their country, right? So there's the skin in the game aspect to it. And more importantly, they're going to do it under conditions that was called the sanguine would not do. This is actually very important. The sanguine are those with experience of just being in a lot of wars, a lot of conflict, that their confidence is coming from their prior experience. And then when they show up and then it's a bad encounter, they're like, oh, heck no. And then they're out of there. That's the problem with mercenaries. That's what Aristotle's comment is about. I bring that up because that's not that far from basically what's later discussed. It was called the nature of knowledge and subaltern knowledge. What that means is if you have a certain master knowledge from more general science, do you have knowledge of the suboptimal knowledges? AKA, if you know math, do you know all things? Right? That kind of line of argument. I had a conversation once. A colleague of mine on Twitter made a comment. It's like, oh, look at all these disparate sciences. What's the science that connects them all? I said metaphysics. He said math. And then and that's the thing. And then I went there and went, well, that's great. But first of all, my friend, I've been putting some points about like how do you explain and he gave an example of like, here's an object. And look at this. There's a 60-degree angle interaction going on. And I commented, I was like, well, wait a minute. And then which is causing what? Is body causing that mathematical angle to exist? Or does the mathematical angle exist because there's body? Or is it both at the same time? And then, et cetera. Like that's, as I said, you're not going to be math can't answer that question. That's a different science that has to answer that discipline or answer that question. Okay, that's related to what we're talking about here with people being self-confident, a lot of times because they believe that. They actually really do believe that by having their knowledge of the master art, math, or whatever, computer science, that they know all other knowledge by that. But that fails. And that fails because of a very important fact of they do not know material necessity related to the conditions. So Aristotle's very famous point in physics is that things have both hypothetical necessity and material necessity. It's both. So what that means is the example of a house. So a dialectician will tell you it's a place of shelter. Someone studying the material conditions would tell you it's stone, brick, hay. You need both because you can't have, without that relationship of the two elements of necessity, you cannot have a house. You have to know both its formal structure and its reason to exist, its function, and its end, you also have to know the things that make it up, because you can't just grab anything to be a house. It has to be certain kinds of things, and that kind of knowledge is not known to someone who just knows math. The mathematician can tell you the angle the house should be and all the other things. They can tell you that, but they cannot tell you what materials to use or what kind of elevation the level ground has to be, etc. That kind of stuff. I mean, examples are always in architecture. The difference between the project manager who's working on the ground applying the blueprint. There's always a translation between blueprints and reality. Someone with knowledge has to do that. So thus, it can't be a top-down stamping out. So, and by the way, actually, I was going to make a comment. This group for me is an example of that. You know why? I don't have. I talked to Javier about this. I need the commitment to go. I'm doing Aristotle and Plato. That's what my focus is on. That's my time domain of limit. I have limited time. I'm going to commit to knowing those topics. Those are my areas of study. I'm going to take the risk to do that. Now, anything else, Kant, even anyone else, I'm useless. I can't help you. I know what general notes about it, but these are not my specialties. So I have to come to the net and rely on you all with your different backgrounds to cover areas that I don't have expertise in. And I'm very okay with that. So I just want to point out that, Daniel, I'm doing that. That's my purpose for being here, is that by doing it, I have a relationship with you all in this ecosystem. I get to have much more coverage now on my understanding. And there's many times a cross intersection. Now, it doesn't help that Aristotle and Plato are the foundations for everybody else, so it helps out that way. But the point of allowing for cross-informational, basically prompt exposure, so that I can think through different parameters, that's a very powerful resource. And that's generally, and by the way, the reason why, why I'm actually more bullish on communities like this than AI would do is because AI makes mistakes. And if you don't know, and actually that relates to material necessity. And I'll tell you why, because I'll give you an example. I was working on a website and I was lazy, and I asked ChatGPT to run the code for me to make a JavaScript parameter, like a component. You have to worry about the particulars of that, what that means. The only thing that's relevant is it did it wrong. And if I just used the code that it just gave me, it wasn't working. I had to know this thing called switch case. So it's a kind of a conditional rule set in JavaScript, a very special kind. I told it, no, this isn't working. Use switch case to do the conditionals for this JavaScript code. And I did it, and it worked. But that's my point. I had to know that. It wasn't like the ChatGPT knew. It tried its best to answer my point, but it wasn't working. So I had to have that kind of material knowledge of the code of how JavaScript operates and what the option, and which, by the way, I was tutored on that. So a tutor gave me that knowledge to know about these options of how to do conditionals in JavaScript, and a bunch of different options based on different needs and use cases that are conditional on what your code needs to do. So I just want to point that out, that's why I'm not bullish on saying, oh, we can replace human interactions with ChatGPT. We can externalize all this with ChatGPT to do this kind of operational kind of gathering of information insight. I don't think so. It also is dependent on you as the prompt generator versus this, which is you guys are just kind of throwing stuff at me. So it's a very different dynamic of there's others from the outside with their agency kind of interacting, which is very much like reality, actually, right? Because as opposed to just like a mental thought experiment where I control the variables and I set the parameters of how we're going to discuss this, nature, reality has a kind of external acting upon you quality. It's randomness and just variation of possibilities of encounters. I think that's quite important. Because also, I just want to close on that last reason why I thought of courage and its innate quality of the citizens having that. It's the idea of self-defense, and this is a very interesting angle, Daniel. You're saying, oh no, that way we'll solve the problem of the kind of Black Mirror terror we're all having in theory that the government's going to there's going to be a techno feudalism, we're going to be just crushed. Is to say, no, if we basically have the same AI, like the same computational power and decentralized networks of communication, we basically can't be conquered, theoretically. Now, that's the argument. I think you can make the other argument, very a la Public Opinion from 1922, that the production of consent via the memeplex is absolutely parent running amok, and is basically the counter argument. The counter argument is basically, are we going to enter into a memeplex of manufactured consent of reality making that will just conveniently spiral us in different directions, separate us into these little isolated meme spheres? or new space, I think is what it's called at the highest level. I forgot how the schema works. Or are we going to use, are citizens going to be in self-defense, philosophical self-defense, use open source networks of communication and sociability like this to basically build a sense spanking within ourselves and produce artifacts and do these kind of interventions on the future? It's kind of interesting. So I just want to share those points.
No, magnificent. If anyone has, I have to go set up chairs for a wedding tomorrow, so but I have a little bit more. And of course, it's super windy, so anything I set up is going to be blown out. But I suppose it's better today than tomorrow. Actually, wind is arguably worse for a wedding than rain. Rain, you can do it inside, it's all cool. But wind is when you're like, maybe we can do it outside, maybe. So there's this, this uncertainty that makes you attempt that of which would be wise not to attempt. So hopefully we'll calm down. But you said a lot there that was very, very good. I think on that idea of first it is that prompt, you give a prompt to the machine versus in a group, the group gives it to you. It's almost the reverse direction in some respects, which I think is very, very interesting. I think also that idea of having the group you make a certain commitment. I think this is getting at it. You make a commitment, but then you put yourself in the midst of others who will bring you into other fields, right? That dynamic seems to be at the heart of many of these groups, like, well, Bloomsbury, for example. It's not that Virginia Woolf would try to be an economist. He's committed to a novelist, but then he's hanging out with Keynes. And but Bertrand Russell is coming over. This sort of, from a commitment, interacting with diversity seems to be proper. And letting it wash over you versus committing to something and then just putting yourself around other specialists of that field. That seems to be getting at the correct way to think this problem. And unfortunately, you could say the culture of specialists today has you just hang out with other specialists of that field, as opposed to exposing you to what is beyond that. And that seems to be really important. I think also that helps resist overconfidence, because if I haven't read these things myself, I'm getting it from other people, that helps you. One, there's a humility in that, because you didn't say do that work, or you haven't put that level of scholarship, and it is being given to you by a mentor, a teacher, a guide, or something, right? So that helps fight the overconfidence that concerns people like a Johnson or a Sowell or et cetera, so forth. But then, of course, you have to learn how to deal with people and to interact with people. And I think also the problem is that tendency of a single theory of everything, right? Like either mathematics or metaphysics. If I learn that, then I have insight into everything. That also is really problematic. And you could say perhaps that is uniquely occurred in the sciences, because if everything is made of atoms, if we understand how atoms move, then we can understand how economies, societies, and everything work, which of course was the dream of some forms of modernity, which is we don't need to worry about the social or the political or the family or different things. As long as we can figure out the correct science or the correct field, that will take care of all of those other things, which is very problematic. I think also, to me, that points into and then I'll give it to Michael if he comes back. I think there's also a difference between moving into other fields to increase your personal resume or status versus to be wrecked. Like you're going into other fields to kind of be wrecked. It's like, wow, you think you knew something, but you don't, right? There's a certain wrecking that occurs, a certain sort of, oh, I've never looked through this vista, right? But you see, I guess when you're dealing with real problems, that one will force you to go into different fields that wreck you or where you make mistakes or different things, because you have no choice. You have this real problem you have to work on. But if you have perhaps the ivory tower intellectuals that are separated from the ground, then if they go into other fields, it's likely they will go into other fields at the very least with a subconscious feeling that they have an expertise that gives them insight into it and that they can shape into their preset complexes. And then also, it will probably be in service of status and gaining reputation, as opposed to when you're going into real things. You have to go into the labyrinth. You have to go into the maze, even though there's a minotaur there, because you have to get what can be found there. And if you don't go into that, there will be massive, massive problems. So I think there's also something about moving into other fields as being experienced as a certain wrecking, as a certain making you realize that your field's not as important as you thought it was. It wasn't the most important field. Actually, all of these fields have a certain role and a certain importance, which brings about a certain humility. And that humility could give rise to a fuller and more diverse humanity, more creative, but it is the road of humility that we don't tend to like. And if anyone has any final things, please. I think that different relationship to other fields is quite important. But you have to genuinely, but I guess this is what it seems to suggest. If you go into other fields with a subconscious hope for a theory of everything, then I think it almost is very difficult not to end up in the the deluded generalist or the overconfident generalist. Whereas if you really believe, no, I have to go field by field and kind of let it wash over me, that seems to be the proper mode. But that requires a certain, well, time, infrastructure, energy. And again, if people are only learning between the ages of, in college, say 18 and 25, then it makes sense that people would actually just in their habits or in the very infrastructure be tilted in the direction of a subconscious theory of everything. They may, if you ask them directly, say, do you think there's a theory of everything? They'd say, no, no, no. But subconsciously in their practice, that may be ultimately how they act, simply in the time allocation only being for that field, not reading books outside of that, and not having conversations and interactions outside of that, right? Like it may, if that doesn't weigh on them as some sort of particular loss or problem, then even if they, when directly asked, will say that a theory of everything or a single specialty is not all we need in life, practically that is in fact how they end up living. And I think basically we haven't had the social coordination mechanism to allow an infrastructure for people to have longer in the learning process, and also the ways to coordinate with people, such as the net or such, where you can have this washing experience. So that's been part of the problem as well. I think also the last thing I'll say is that I think also we're not going into other fields to be surprised. Like, we talk all the time about encounter and surprise, right? Like we're going into other fields to expand our conquest or to expand our imperialism, as opposed to, well, I now have a certain expertise, so now I have capacity to handle surprise, because that seems to be the relation. Like you need some sort of commitment, some sort of expertise to be able to handle hearing things you don't understand, or being surprised by ideas, or encountering otherness and negativity. Like if you go into the vast array of thought and you have no anchor, that seems to lead to perhaps a person getting lost. There's some sort of almost developmental track here, right? So there's where if you go into that too early, that may lead to one getting lost in the maze because they don't have a golden thread. But if you have a specialization or you have a certain skill, then you have a golden thread to go into this vaster array of thought. So specialization and commitment it seems to be, in my opinion, some sort of necessary step. The problem is it usually stops there. It doesn't go beyond there. And you could say that's because of the material condition that has lacked the infrastructure by which average people can continue to engage in the process. But now we have that. And now we need to continue to complement that and to work. And I'll give it to Mr. Jonkin here. And yes, I do have to think more and more. You're correct. The idea of open source as self-defense, that could lead to, it may not work out, but it is interesting to think of it from that angle. Because again, otherwise there you do seem kind of destined to a black mirror or something like that, or you ultimately have to trust the state, and that could be problematic. More has to be said, but let me give it back to you, Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin.
Yeah, we can definitely put on. I think it's reasonable to put on the side the open source question for self-defense, because we can spend a whole hour talking about that. No, it's interesting. I just think about this also, that even the structure of organizations is against this. I'll let you guys, I'm just reflecting on this, because you know what? Think about this. We have individual contributors, and then we have this project manager, like the person. It's this middle manager. It's the, notice in every single, in all these corporate, in all entities, academics, healthcare, most corporations that get to scale up, they have to have more and more managers who are the mediators, who are so theoretically the ones who are doing this kind of social permeability of the domains. So this is where the NPC phenomenon shows up. That's exactly what it's about. So part of the self-defense is asking the question, the general conclusion is that no, individual social ability is not relevant, is not needed. We're going to offset it by to imaginarial class to mediate the social emotional information required for the coordination of these siloed individual contributors. So that's been the general answer. Some hypothesize the technology can do it, but you're right, Daniel. I think in the sense of, because it's been questioned the technology removing the necessity of that amount of imaginarial intervention. But then the question becomes, individuals have to be trained for sociability then. Actually, that's what it's the contingent on. If that's not there, then it's useless. It's just going to be, and via that or the idea of like digital contracts, right? That we're going to just basically do like kind of legalistic, right, rule conditional of, did the individual contributor do his part? Yes, he gets his tokens, and that's it. And then the algorithm is the one who is the mediator. So it's not even a human being anymore, not even an imaginary human being per se. I want to hear your thoughts about that, because that's my first image from what you just said.
Yeah, no, I strongly think that we can look at the PMC bureaucracy, all of these different things as filling in the, you're trying to deal with complexity in a world that does not have the efficient technology of coordination on a social coordination. Therefore, you're going to have to outsource it to some sort of bureaucratic apparatus. I think that is exactly the case. I think now you have the technology to better deal with that. And that's why I think it is very important not to demonize history, because often what arises is, well, relative to what was available at the time. It's just, I always like, as we've talked about before, I like to talk about overfitting, underfitting, right? It's not really right and wrong. There's just a point where now you're overfitting that technology. It had a role, and now you need to get rid of it, or you're underfitting the technology. You're not applying it in the way you need to, right? And so bureaucracy, and you could say basically the structures of capitalism, basically post-World War II, although that's very broad and it has varied a lot, all were fitting, had a role. But then there comes a time where it begins overfitting. And it usually is starting to do that when you see the unintentional consequences of that technology on the person. But to your point, the technology is all dependent on the social capacity of people. Do they have social capacity? I think the same applies to Web 3.0, which as being suggested. Like decentralization and Web 3.0 technologies, there are no guarantees. Like it could just go into basically having the algorithm do our humanity for us, which means nothing. In the same way that this technology can just go in the direction of content creation, not social engagement, right? Like that's that radical contingency, right? Like it's not guaranteed that it necessarily goes in that direction. And what I think Hegel would basically suggest is, well, even if there's 200 years of it going in a bad direction, eventually, because of the pathologies, it would come around and people would use it in the right way. But this is why I think it's interesting to think what Hegel would have said after the atom bomb, after these mass military technologies, after complexity, where these systems are so complex where if one node goes off, the whole thing goes off, right? So, given that, even though there's something to be said about over a long enough time span, assuming we are not all killed, that things would come around to the right order, if you now have the technology to make that, to make the Fermi paradox come to pass, some great filter you don't get by, maybe not, right? So there's something to be thought. But the role of the social is big, but this is also why a part of belonging again in 2.3 is really emphasizing the necessity of classroom reform as a medium. If in the school you are being taught that an educated person is good at trivia, well, then that removes bringing together learning and thinking and conversation and interaction together in the very medium of school. And so that greatly reduces the probability that you regain a social, because people don't know how to interact and they don't know how to incorporate thinking into interaction, right? You have the necessity of replacing resumes with portfolios, because that would also create an incentive to learn how to engage on a higher human activity versus to just get the line marks that you can show on the resume, et cetera, so forth, right? There's things also where Web 3.0 technology, in my opinion, has to go in the direction of the ability to invest in people, not where right now investment is stuck in investing in equity in corporations. We don't have the ability to say, invest in Thomas Jockin and give you liquidity flow to make what you're doing sustainable. And then over a certain metric, and this would get into that conversation, over 5 years, $50 turns into $500, right? You make money, I make money. We don't have an ability to decentralize non-zero sumness between people on an investment model. Investment is still very captured by the corporate structure. And if capitalism, and we've talked about this, if capitalism is now risk capitalism, you have to take risk. You can't simply save money. You can't save to get ahead. You have to make money and then risk it in a strategic way to actually have it build upon one another just because of how the mechanisms have gone. Then if risk is only if the only way to take risk as a person is in corporations, the stock market, or equity, that means the flow of capital has to go toward the larger structures, right? But if there was a way to take risk in one another and to move in that direction, then you could have a decentralization of risk flow, which would actually then create options of sustainability between people, and open up different doors. But we're not going to, even if you had the technology, various forms of tokenization, like the yes/no token or different things, even if you had these technologies without social capacity, they would not be used this way. And people would not be able to discern potential in one another and what could actually lead to extensions of humanity. So decentralizing investment may just accelerate the problem, right? It's all contingent on some sort of fundamental human capacity that cannot be replaced, because it is the human ultimate. It is the human element at the end of the day, some variable that if the human doesn't do, it's not there. And there's no other way to do it than humans doing it, right? Well, that right there is the possibility for the human always having a role, because there's something that the human must do to be, but it is also why we're faced with such a difficult problem, because how do you get people to do it, right? Like, what would it look like to do it? What would create the incubator of those different things, right? And that's where many questions arise. So I think what you're getting at is very important. It does come back to some sort of restoring of the social in a very important way. And Mr. Luber, I was about to cut because I have to go put up chairs at the wedding venue. It's lovely that you came back. If you have any final thoughts, I know we were just talking about many things. Ultimately, some sort of fundamental social need that has to come into picture, that if it does not, basically what is argued in the introduction of Belonging Again 2.2 is that in the 18th century, instead, where you had a seeing of the possibility of the social as an entity in itself, where society became a thing with sociology, we talked about boredom arising at the same time. Like, instead of actually owning that and cultivating the social, we instead outsourced that work to the economy. The economy did that work of human interaction and mediating our relations, and that worked fine for a bit. But now, if you have this great stagnation, if you have this overfitting of that model, then you have to recover those social capacities, or you will continue to go in this reductionist flattening direction, which is very, very problematic. So those are the stakes. But it's been a treat. Mr. Luber, it's good to see your face before I had to go. It's really nice. I think you're great. And Christian, always good to see you, sir. And Mr. Joggin, if you don't hear from me again, assume that one of the chairs blew up into my head and knocked me out, and that I died on the side of a hill at the wedding venue. So, that might be like a theme wedding where there's a dead body, and maybe I'll be like the Gerardian sacrifice that brings peace, and the wedding otherwise would have given into memetics and like destroyed itself. But because somebody died, it will be the best wedding ever. So, maybe that's how it will all work out. But thank you all. It's a treat. Best to you now.